Sawadika. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we have sufficient number of participants, and in the interest of time, I would like to kickstart this webinar. So I would like to extend a very warm good afternoon to our ASEAN colleagues as well as our Thai colleagues who join us here, and also a very good morning to our colleagues from the European Union and Norway. And thank you everyone for joining us and be with us here today in our webinar. This webinar is co-organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand and in collaboration with the Ministry of Higher Education, Science, Research and Innovation, the ASEAN BCG Network, as well as the ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue. For those of you who have joined us before in the previous sessions, you would recall that we have provided you with an overview of the BCG economy model or the bio-circular green economy model, as well as its application to the agricultural sector. Now in this session of the webinar, which is the third session, we will be focusing on the green part of the bio-circular green economy model policy and show you how the green economy policy can contribute to the acceleration of clean energy transition in ASEAN. Before we start our program today, allow me to provide two important housekeeping information for you. After our speakers has made their presentation, a time for Q&A will also be provided. And if you wish to make a question or comment, you could do so by using the raise hands questions at the bottom of the screen, or you can put your question in the chat box as well, and one of our staff will be there to assist you. All presentation materials will also be made available for participants. And after the webinar is concluded today, we will be sending a link to download the presentations to all participants' registered email addresses. So to start off our session today, I would like to relay a video message from Her Excellency Ms. Usana Piranon, Director General of the ASEAN Affairs Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for her opening remarks.
สวัสดีค่ะ Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome all of you to the webinar ASEAN Bio-Circular Green Economy Knowledge Sharing Series. Thank you for joining us. Building on the momentum for the first two sessions, where we illustrated the concept and practical application of the Bio-Circular Green or the BCG economy model in the agriculture sector, this third session will emphasize the green aspect of the BCG model, particularly in relation to the energy sector and the transition towards renewable energy in ASEAN. I have the pleasure to welcome our distinguished speakers from the ASEAN Center for Energy, the European Union, and Norway, who will share with us their insights and knowledge in the energy landscape, as well as their respective best practices in promoting renewable energy transition. I wish to extend my sincerest appreciation to all the speakers for your participation and invaluable contribution to this webinar. I hope that their unique experiences will provide excellent food for thought for all the participants today. I also thank our co-host, the Ministry of Higher Education, Science, Research and Innovation, the ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue, and the ASEAN BCG Network for their continued support to this series. Distinguished participants, ASEAN is home to over 660 million people and has a combined GDP of $3 trillion, being the third largest economy in Asia and the fifth largest in the world. By 2040, our population size is expected to grow to 770 million. These figures paint a clear picture of how important the energy sector is to ASEAN's peoples and the economy. The International Energy Agency estimated that ASEAN's demand for energy grew by more than 80% between the year 2000 and 2019, and will grow a further 60% by 2040. However, Our region still relies heavily on fossil fuels, with negative consequences on the climate, ecosystems, biodiversity, and livelihoods of the communities across ASEAN. Therefore, we must find a more sustainable way to address the increased energy demand and promote economic growth. The adverse ramifications of the conflicts in various parts of the world also underline the need to enhance energy security in our region. It is encouraging to see that ASEAN policymakers have already shown political will and commitment to promote renewable and less carbon-intensive energy. The ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation 2021 to 2025 has outlined a 5-year sustainability plan, setting a target of 23% share of renewable energy in total primary energy supply in the region, and 35% in ASEAN installed power capacity by 2025. Accelerating renewable energy transition to achieve these targets is certainly an uphill task and requires a region-wide approach and actions. While energy policies and priorities of each ASEAN member state vary, we do share a common aspiration to ensure energy supplies that meet expanding energy demand while contributing to climate goals and achieving sustainable energy for all. As the ASEAN coordinator on Sustainable Development Cooperation, Thailand hopes to be a part of the engine driving forward such vision. We hope to help bridge the knowledge gaps by exploring synergies and enhancing engagements with ASEAN's external partners, whose experiences and best practices can offer valuable capacity building tools for ASEAN member states, as well as open doors for further cooperation. I am confident that this webinar will be a great opportunity for all participants to learn and exchange ideas to speed up our journey towards increased renewable energy sources in ASEAN. We must work together to address tomorrow's challenges today and pave the ways for the realization of the ASEAN community that is inclusive, resilient, and leave no one behind. Thank you and ขอบคุณค่ะ
Thank you very much for the video message of Her Excellency, the Director General Usana. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming our first speaker today. We have Mr. Benny Suryadi, Manager of Power, Fossil Fuel, Alternative Energy and Storage at the ASEAN Center for Energy, joining us. Mr. Suryadi has over 14 years of experience in managing programs and conducting research on energy and climate change, and he currently leads energy partnerships with important ASEAN partners such as the US, India, and as well as Norway. He also oversees high-profile projects, including the ASEAN Energy and Climate Change Project, and he will walk us through the current state of renewable energy in ASEAN today and share his views on the challenges and opportunities of this sector in ASEAN. Mr. Suryadi, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Warm greeting, everyone. First, I would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand for inviting me to represent the ASEAN Center for Energy to share the updates on the situation of renewable energy in ASEAN region, on the opportunities and challenges. Next slide, please. Before I further speak about renewable energy development, allow me to briefly introduce about the institution that I'm representing for, which is the ASEAN Center for Energy. As the ASEAN Center for Energy is one of the ASEAN entity where we are focusing on the issue of the energy. We are the secretariat for the implementation of the regional blueprint on the energy cooperation, as mentioned by Excellency before, the ASEAN Plan of Action for the Energy Cooperation, which currently run for the phase 2, 2021 and 2025. The ASEAN Center for Energy act as a catalyst and knowledge hub and as a think tank for the policy makers from all of the 10 ASEAN countries to accelerate the integration of the energy strategy within the ASEAN region to achieve harmony on the economic growth and environmental sustainability. Next slide, please. As mentioned by the Excellency before in the opening speech, that ASEAN historically rely on the fossil fuels. In some context, this is the thing that fueling or become the engine of the economic growth of the ASEAN for many decades, in which now we are enjoying the position as the third biggest economic in the ASEAN. That's almost considered for the $3 trillion. So to fuel the economic growth, the energy supply has increased significantly over the decades. As you can see in the screen on how the coal, oil, and gas is dominating the regional energy mix since decades ago until today, which accounted for about 83% of the regional energy mix in 2020. Unfortunately, for the context of renewable energy, it still stood on the figures of the 14.3% of the renewable energy of the energy mix as a whole, while the remaining amount is coming from the traditional biomass, because there are still a significant amount of the people in this region that rely on traditional biomass for their energy source. Next slide, please. So yesterday, during the 40th ASEAN Minister on Energy meeting that virtually hosted by the Cambodia, the ASEAN Center for Energy released our flagship study called the ASEAN Energy Outlook 2007. So in this outlook, we explore multiple possible futures to finding the right path for the region to move towards a low carbon economy. This includes to assess the current baseline scenario, or also to look on the existing target that being injected or being committed by the countries in this region already, or also to look on the aspirational regional target on renewable energy and energy efficiency, as mentioned before in the opening remark, to achieve 23% of renewable energy by 2025. Unfortunately, in the number scenario that we are running for, as you can see on the screen, the region will still continue to rely on the fossil fuels. As the fossil fuels in all of this scenario will continue to supply most of the regional energy demand. Next slide, please. So as we specifically focusing on the renewable energy, from 2005, we are still around between 10 to 14% of the renewable energy share, while the target that we have to achieve is 23% in 2025, or only around 3 years from now, which is quite a significant effort is needed to achieve this target. Unfortunately, if we continue the same on what we are doing today, the number is not telling a good story in the futures. Because as you see in the baseline scenario, the renewable energy in 2050 will still around 11.9%, unless more effort is being injected, be it at national level or regional level, to increase the penetration of renewable energy in the whole energy system. Next slide, please. But as that story on the whole energy system is not really a good one, I am sharing with you the spotlight on the power sector, where the good story exists. Power sector meaning specifically on the electricity issue. Approximately in the year of 2020, this 10 countries in the ASEAN region cumulatively installed around 22 gigawatt of the new capacity. And 82% of this new capacity is coming from renewable energy. This is the record breaking that beat from everyone prediction before. Lao PDR created a new hydro capacity, while Vietnam significantly increased its solar capacity. So as you can see in the screen that how the year of 2020, the country in this region enjoying the roaring growth of the renewable energy, particularly on the solar case. And it's, as you can also see in the screen, generally represented by the Vietnam. But that's helped the region to achieve our common target. As mentioned before, there are 35% of the renewable energy in the store capacity that's expected to be achieved in 2025. And in the year 2020, we are already 33.5%, or only 1.5% gap from our target. You can also see that how each country is having its share of renewable energy. Doesn't mean that countries have less renewable energy considered bad compared to others, because we do recognize that each country has a different resource on the energy. Some country doesn't have a benefit, have a lot of renewable energy resource, while the others like Laos or Vietnam is heavily enjoying with a lot of hydro and the solars. So, but the country is raising their effort to increase their renewable energy capacities to cumulative achieve the ASEAN target. Next slide, please. So, as again mentioned that most of the renewable energy development in this region is driven by the solar and wind. Solar is shining, wind is blowing, bringing the green electricity into the grid. Solar and wind become the core more RE development in region. As you can see in the picture that where thanks to the solar and wind, that renewable energy capacity that surpass the fossil fuels capacity installment in this region. But unfortunately, it's still not equally distributed among the countries, as most of this new installed capacity is generated by Vietnam, particularly on the solar, or also Philippines and Thailand for the wind capacity. Next slide, please. But renewable energy is not only can be produced and used at the domestic level, at the national level. We also have what we call it ASEAN Power Grid, which is a system that connects all of the electricity infrastructure in the ASEAN region, connecting the existing infrastructure from the 10 countries in this region so that we can integrate the system, utilizing the resource in one area for the benefit of the others' demand. As you can see that currently we have around 7,722 existing cross-border interconnection, be it, for example, from Laos to Thailand or from Vietnam to Laos, Vietnam to Cambodia, or between Indonesia and Malaysia. This allowing that renewable energy in one particular countries can be generated and used in another countries, so that it can help other countries to have more renewable energy, and also at some point to get the electricity at a more affordable price. And good news is also recently in the June 2020, Singapore commenced first renewable energy electricity import via regional multilateral power trade. So the electrons generated in Laos through the hydropower plant being transported to Thailand, and then goes to the Malaysia, and then being consumed into Singapore. So this is the beauty of renewable energy. Even thought that the resources exist is far away from the demand, but that it can be generated and then bringing to the other region that needs more the energy. Next slide, please. So just to add in, what is the key driving on this green investment? Well, we all know that renewable energy still have a trouble issue or challenge on this cost, but significant reduction in the upfront investment costs, especially in the solar and the wind energy projects, making them become more competitive with the fossil fuels. It's not applicable to all of the region that, but as you can see, in the case of the Vietnam, also in Thailand and the in Malaysia, that renewable energy become more cost competitive. And more support from the government is also being released, such as a feed-in tariff or an option that makes the renewable energy development become interesting for the developers. And access to the finance also become more and more available because many multilateral financial institutions have created the program that support renewable energy. This is also thanks to raising awareness and building the capacity of the policymakers, of the relevant stakeholders to promote the advantage and integration of renewable energy in national energy mix strategy. Most of the policymakers already put the renewable energy as a priority, so that helps how the renewable energy is growing despite the challenge that they are still facing. And of course, all of us, the users, with giving a growing demand and pressure to have a green renewable energy, where the public could be any of us that expected that our electricity to be generated from a clean source, not from the fossil fuels, but more from the renewable energy. So this also a pressure or the driving force to having more renewable energy into our system that integrate sustainability in all the energy related policy and investment decision. Next slide, please. But we cannot being blindly from the fact that still additional costs of energy system for renewable energy projects. As renewable energy just become a mainstream in this region, so that assessing only the cost of renewable energy against traditional generating technology somehow does not provide a full picture of the actual cost. So this is where some misconception is always happen that it only look on the isolated case that being seen the renewable energy is more expensive. But if we look more comprehensively that how renewable energy can create a better environment, a better air quality, a better health impact, then renewable energy definitely at affordable cost compared to the others. So such a comparison does not incorporate the high cost that RE is now having. Of course, the intermittent nature of renewable energy that needs backup, storage, that's a significant amount. And also, renewable energy usually require a vast area of land, like a solar farm or a wind farm that have a need require vast area of land compared to the fossil fuels. And also what's wrongly happened quite a lot that the best load generation is prematurely displaced when renewable capacity is built during an adequate power supply. So there is a proper transition is needed. But these are the valid point. I mean, the transition from the fossil fuels to renewable energy. But it doesn't take away the positive impact and cost advantage that renewable energy offers in long run for us in this region. Next slide. Yeah, this will be my last slide to speak on the recommendation that how to scale up development of renewable energy. Of course, many things that can be done, and then everybody should take a role, policymakers, private sector, business player, academia, where the research and development sitting, and also us at the ASEAN Center for Energy that advocating a better policy framework to support renewable energy development, so that they attract a private investor to the investor-friendly company and the licensing process, or learning more from the global experience that has already successfully stimulated renewable investment. I think this is something that we can learn from the Norway case. And they process very different renewable energy technology. Solar and wind definitely front runners here in the region, but we still have a lot of option for renewable energy, wave tidal or also the bioenergy helps the region to go greener with the biofuels as well. And all of it is also need the investment in grid improvement in energy storage system. We cannot also run away in the fact that renewable energy with its intermittent, with its curtailment issue, there's a needs the improvement on the grids and the energy storage system. And therefore to develop a centralized energy. Some country is only in this region is one island, big island, but another countries like Philippines or Indonesia is consists of a lot of small island where the centralized energy will be a key solution of that. But on top of it, there is a need to speed up regional connectivities and cooperation, be it on the technical levels such as the ASEAN Power Grid or on the policy or more higher framework that we are aspiring at the ASEAN levels. And I believe the discussion that we have today is also an effort to speed up the regional connectivity and cooperation. This will be a last my slide. I like to thank you very much again for the organizer, and I'm happy to have a follow-up discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suryadi. I think we can spare a couple of minutes for questions and comments from the floor before we move on to our next speaker. So if anyone has any comments or questions that you would like to ask, we're looking at the ASEAN context right now and the status of the development of renewable energy in ASEAN. And I totally agree with you that there are a lot of challenges that lie ahead, including in terms of costs and also awareness for people to actually, not only the practitioner, but also the policymakers to actually give more emphasis and prioritize, accelerating clean energy for our electricity and power needs and demands. Any questions from the floor at this stage? You can either raise your hands or also post the questions in the comments or chat box as well. All right, if I see no comments so far, so in the interest of time, let's just move on to our next speaker. And as you mentioned, I think there are a lot of opportunities, not only within the ASEAN region itself, but also an opportunity to learn and exchange with our partners as well. We have the honor to welcome one of our very important partners of ASEAN, the European Union, who will share with us today the views and experiences and lessons learned from the EU. The EU is currently revamping its whole climate and energy legislation to align with the need to achieve net zero emission by 2050, and also to ensure resilience and independence from fossil fuels. So I think these are one of the aspects definitely that us in ASEAN can learn from. Today we have the honor to welcome Mr. Matthew Balu, Policy Officer, Renewables and Energy System Integration Policy Unit of the European Union, who has joined us today from Brussels. Good morning, Matthew. I hope you're doing well. Let me introduce Mr. Matthew shortly. Mr. Balu works in the European Commission Service in charge of defining and implementing the EU's renewable energy policy. He has more than 15 years of experience in European clean energy policy, working for both public and private sector, as well as for public interest groups. So I think it would be very interesting indeed to hear your views and your experience in this matter. So please, Mr. Matthew, the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure, it's an honor to be invited to talk with you today. Indeed, I think we have some interesting experience to share on the EU side, because by now we have accumulated many years of experience in the clean energy transition, and made probably early mistakes that allowed us to learn what works and what works less, but also because we're really accelerating that transition, especially in the light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where what was happening and the geopolitical and economic consequences really vindicated our general approach on accelerating the clean energy transition. I believe you have a short video that will illustrate briefly that part of the story and how we are accelerating that transition in reaction to the war in Ukraine. Thank you. This so-called Repower EU plan was launched in May 2020, but it's only one step in a series of policy actions that the EU has been undertaking for years now. So I would like to tell you a bit about that story, and in a way present it maybe as an illustration, especially to policymakers, on how you can promote renewable energy and what, in our opinion, are the key steps for that. So there will be two parts in that presentation. The first one is about the importance of keeping a very clear direction, which allows you to react quickly to external shocks, to increased needs, and keep your direction in a fast evolving policy context. And as a second part, I will go more into some specific elements of various technologies or specific policy aspects that we learned from that experience. Next slide, please. The first part of that presentation is really about explaining how the long-term decarbonization target guides all our policy. This is an illustration of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions from various sectors and the trajectories compatible with deep emission reductions. And all sectors must play a role, and all sectors must really see their emissions fall dramatically. And in that, energy, of course, has a central place because its supply and use is responsible for 3/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. The development of renewable energy is central to that reduction and elimination of emissions from the energy sector. And if you look at what our policy goals have been over the past 8 years, all the time for the target year 2030, it shows you an incredible picture of how our understanding of what is politically and technically feasible has evolved. So we had an original EU target of 20% renewables in the whole energy mix, not only electricity, of 20%. We overachieved that target. But while we were working towards that 2020 target, we also set a new target for 2030. It was initially set back in 2014 at a level of 27%. So a projected increase of 7 percentage points against the 2020 target of 20%. Then in various policy revisions, that 2030 target kept being raised and raised. So 4 years later, in the actual act of legislation that was supposed to implement the target, we raised it to 32%. Last year, as part of a broader exercise, which was meant to align all EU policies with a new climate target for 2030 and put us on the trajectory to long-term decarbonization, we raised it to 40% of renewables in the whole EU energy consumption. And this year, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the need to diversify, to move away from fossil fuel imports, we raised again that target level to 45%. It's the same target. It's the renewable energy target for 2030. And over the course of less than 8 years, our understanding of where it should be set increased fourfold. That is largely related to the falling costs of renewables. On the right, everyone knows how fast the costs of photovoltaics, of wind energy have fallen, and the resulting exponential growth of those technologies. But it's also the reflection that it's actually cleverly invested political capital and finance, and our understanding of the general energy system has also evolved and makes us realize that it is possible to have 45% of your energy use coming from renewable energy. It's possible to have more than 70% of your electricity use coming from renewable energy by 2030. Next slide, please. And I will stress that again, because it's not only electricity. This might be a complex picture, but it shows you the whole EU energy consumption in 2010, today, and how we want it to be in 2030. In light blue at the bottom, you have the direct electricity use. Then above it, you have the energy used in transport, mostly oil. And at the top, you have heat consumption, heating and cooling. In the EU, of course, it's largely heating. In the ASEAN region, you will have a cooling component that is growing extremely fast. In yellow, it's the share of these that is currently provided by renewable energy. It's a high share in electricity, but if you look only at the electricity picture, you have the feeling that we have already done a lot. But if you look at the whole picture and the whole energy use, you see that in transport and in the provision of heat, the share of renewables is still quite low. And what we want is not only to fully decarbonize our electricity production as fast as possible, but also to crack those sectors and to finally manage to develop renewable energy use in those. And this will also be helped by the fact that the three shapes are decreasing. Saving energy is the best way to reduce the use of fossil fuel. Next slide, please. What I want to show here is what the energy system of tomorrow should look like. Because promoting renewable energy, especially variable renewable energy, is part of a comprehensive vision. And that, we realize, is very important if you want to be able to take all decisions strategically, understand all the interactions between decisions you take in terms of developing your power grids, in terms of developing your storage capacity, your transport policy, and so on, and avoiding decisions that will lock you into high expenses in the future, or stranded assets, or future greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see it as a kind of pyramid, where the basis is really a more efficient, a more circular energy system, where you reduce all unnecessary energy consumption, where you save energy wherever possible. Then the easiest way to increase the share of renewable energy is to develop renewable electricity. it will be PV and wind as the primary contributors, and convert as many uses of energy as possible to the direct use of electricity. In our case, it's in the EU, it's really largely about technologies like heat pumps, for instance, replacing gas heating, but it's also valid for transport. It's valid for many industrial uses. And then for those sectors where it's harder to convert them to electricity, some heavy industry where you need very high temperatures, like steel industry, or heavy transport, there new fuels such as hydrogen produced by renewable electricity come in and are now able to provide solutions for those sectors that used to be a kind of climate dead end where there was no clear technological solution. The energy system today is largely linear. You extract petroleum, you burn it in an engine. You extract coal, you burn it in a power plant. You produce electricity, you consume electricity. The future integrated energy system will see energy flows between users and producers. Many people will produce their own electricity. Companies as well will produce their own energy, be it biogas, electricity, biofuels. Energy carriers will convert into one another. Hydrogen can be used to store energy as well. So planning this really in advance and having a strategic view is very important. That's one of the main elements of our current understanding of energy policy making. And of course, this all comes with enormous investment needs, primarily in improving the infrastructure, then of course in new generation and in helping industry convert its uses and so on. Next slide, please. So that's the vision of the energy system and all the interactions, but there are also interactions with lots of other policies. So in the EU, for instance, our laws on renewable energy are related to the climate targets, of course, but also to our policy on the renovation of buildings, on biodiversity, and for instance, the sustainability of bioenergy is a key point there. And on top of that, we had a series of crises, of external crises. COVID, of course, and COVID recovery. We placed renewable energy and energy efficiency at the core of that COVID recovery. Structural high energy prices caused largely by the high fossil fuel prices, and then the invasion of Ukraine, which on the one hand made that high energy price situation even more acute, and also posed grave geopolitical concerns to the EU in terms of its energy independence. So our policymaking happens in that context where things are moving very fast in terms of technologies, in terms of available costs, in terms of our understanding of the whole system, and external crises. And throughout all that, the key point is really that clear direction. We want to decarbonize our system. Energy efficiency and renewable energy are the ways to do it. Next slide, please. So for ASEAN, what could a kind of roadmap for renewable energy look like? The International Renewable Energy Agency produced this week, I think, released its renewable energy outlook for the ASEAN region. I started reading it. It's very interesting, and it shows a number of elements that are very close to what I mentioned there, and that we saw for the EU. The fact that renewable energy will, if ASEAN is to set itself on a decarbonization course in line with Paris objectives, renewable energy will become the primary energy source across the region. And electrification will be a major driver for decarbonization. The total energy consumption will actually reduce thanks to electrification, thanks to switching to modern fuels. and this will result in dramatic reductions of greenhouse gas emissions in the long term. So this is really a very interesting report that tackles many different topics. Next slide, please. For the EU, one element that I really want to stress is how regional cooperation was essential, because we achieved our common target of 20% renewables by 2020. We actually overachieved it, but there were big differences between member states, and not all have the same potential. The economic structures, the industrial structure of the countries are very different, and the target was distributed between member states, but cooperation mechanisms were also designed to allow member states to, for instance, finance the development of renewables in another country, and that those renewables could be counted against its own target. The development of cross-border transmission lines is essential to allow a balancing of the whole system across the continent, because the wind doesn't always blow in some parts, but there's always somewhere where the wind blows or the sun shines, and the more you develop renewable energy, the more important that will be. So that integration and that regional approach is really something that is extremely important, also in the strategic planning ahead of the actual achievement. And the other thing is that achievement of the EU target, as I mentioned before, hides a bit the fact that progress has not been the same for renewable electricity, where the fast development of wind and solar have allowed us to already have almost 40% of our electricity coming from renewables, but slower in other sectors. Next slide, please. So those are the key lessons that I wanted to mention, and I show them here again. Regional cooperation has been essential, and without strong cooperation, the achievement of an internal market at the European scale, the development of infrastructure between member states, and joint projects and cooperation, we would not be able to move as fast as we are moving. Electricity, we see a good development of PV and wind. We have changed our support schemes. We're moving away from feed-in tariffs to mostly auctions, competitive processes, where renewables are more and more able to compete on the market, as well as new instruments such as power purchase agreements. But we are entering new difficulties now. The difficulties are largely about permitting, permit durations, complex administrative procedures that make the projects slower and longer. And this is the next stage of difficulties that we're starting to tackle. And the uptake of renewables has been too slow in heating and cooling, in transport and industry. So we needed specific action there as well. Next slide, please. So there are various issues, and there are specific solutions for each of these. I don't think I will enter into the detail of all of these, but I will make my slides available after the event. But roughly speaking, let's say, our current approach is that for the power sector, you have different issues with different sizes of installations. The big projects are able to compete in terms of costs with fossil power. They start to not need actual financial support, but really more predictability. So it's really about offering predictability to investors, reducing the duration of permits. And in terms of the small projects, it's really about incentivizing customers, individuals, communities, cities to develop small-scale projects. So promote self-consumption of renewables, promote community models. We have a specific initiative that will be integrated to our building renovation strategy and building requirement strategy to include solar rooftop systematically. Then in terms of the system, the more you add variable renewables, the more you have to tackle that challenge of variability, but also make sure that your infrastructure is able to deal with that new variable production, the fact that it's more distributed, it's not only big units, and so on. And you also have to tackle the role of incumbent companies that might not be always ready to give up the space. You need functioning markets with transparent rules that allow new players to play a role, and so on. For heating and cooling, the issues are different. There you have a myriad of players. You're talking about individual homes. The financing is more complex because you don't have single big projects, but you have to aggregate many smaller projects. You have to relate this directly to building renovation strategies to make sure that the renewable energy you put into your cooling doesn't immediately go through your leaky walls and roofs. You need skilled installers who actually know the machines, who know the technologies to be able to do this. In the south, in the global south, the issue is really the very fast growth of cooling. And you need energy efficiency, very clear and strict energy efficiency criteria to avoid wasting a lot of your electricity into inefficient appliances. For transport, there it's really about managing to move away from oil in a sector that is at the moment still almost 100% oil. There are two ways there that will have to coexist. One is the electric way, and the other one is other fuels, biofuels, possibly synthetic fuels. They pose various issues in terms of infrastructure, especially. One of the issues we are tackling in the EU is, of course, the sustainability of bioenergy, both for biofuels and for forest biomass. And as we realize that there are parallel crises, the biodiversity crisis next to a climate crisis, we keep reinforcing also our standards in that respect. To leave space for some questions, I think I will stop here, or I will just jump to my last slide, if you don't mind. Skipping a couple of the next ones. And just mention the topic of regional power system integration, because I think in the context of ASEAN, this is a message that I need to stress again. In the EU, a prerequisite to the fast development of renewable power was really open markets, and an integrated European energy market with clear regulations that apply to all transmission system operators, with transparent rules. Then the transmission capacity, expand it, adapt it to where the renewable production will be, allow it to also manage those new flows, but also expand the distribution capacity. A lot of that renewable generation will happen at distribution level, and develop more and more joint projects to allow countries to work together. This is, for instance, the case for offshore projects, where you can also reduce considerably the need for new transmission if you plan together such hybrid assets. I will stop on that note. Thanks a lot for your attention, and sorry for the very dense presentation. It was a very broad topic.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It is very comprehensive, and I think it gives a very nice overview, not only of the EU policy itself, but also I think you summarized quite succinctly and quite nicely the lessons that the EU has learned, with which I think a lot of our participants from the public sector can definitely it's definitely a food for thought for our public sector in ASEAN as well. And I think in the EU context, as you are a regional organization as well as ASEAN, I think the lessons that you learn and also, the stress on the need for the regulatory clarity and also cooperation between member states definitely rings really, really close to home. I think in ASEAN, we do have the same problems in terms of trying to coordinate and bridging the gaps of differences in economic sector, in economic structure of each member states. So I would like to, before I start my own questions, I would like to open the floor to our participants. If anyone has any comments or any additional questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to do so. So in the meantime, I think just to allow a couple of minutes for participants to finalize. So just in the meantime, this is probably one of my personal interests because there have been a lot of talks about green hydrogen becoming one of the the new sources of clean energy or renewable energy, so to say. And there have been a lot of talks regarding how the hydrogen would become the energy source for the future, especially for the heavy sector, heavy energy intense sector, like in transportation or even in industry. I think in ASEAN, we do not have a very, very vibrant development of green hydrogen so far. But in your views, looking at the next, say, 5 to 8 years, in your views, what is the future of green hydrogen? Is it going to definitely become one of the power of the future, so to say, or the development of green hydrogen still needs a way to go?
Hydrogen currently represents less than 2% of the whole energy use in the EU today, and more than 95% of it is currently produced from fossil fuels. So at the moment, renewable hydrogen is really a very, very limited thing. We are investing a lot into it. Yesterday, on Wednesday, the president of the EU Commission announced the launch of a so-called European Hydrogen Bank with 3 billion euro invested in it to accelerate the development of renewable hydrogen. When we talk about renewable hydrogen, it's hydrogen produced by electrolyzers that use electricity, a large amount of electricity to produce hydrogen. Hydrogen has many advantages. It burns without producing greenhouse gas emissions, but two things really have to be kept in mind. The first one is that we're really at the very initial stage, and our hydrogen strategy is based on several stages, where the priority today in the first stage is really to replace the current fossil produced hydrogen by renewable hydrogen, then starts expanding its use and start replacing other fossil fuels by hydrogen usage. But it will remain a scarce resource because it requires a very large amount of electricity to produce it. Today in the EU, 40% of our electricity comes from renewables. Close to half of our electricity comes from non-fossil sources. By 2030, it will be more than 80%. So our energy system will be largely decarbonized. So if you use electricity, you will, by definition, use decarbonized electricity to produce hydrogen. But in other systems, it really makes sense in climate terms, in economic terms, when you have a very, very abundant and cheap electricity resource to produce it. And in terms of consumption, it's also especially relevant for specific uses. You mentioned it, heavy industry, heavy transport, but there again, it's really important to assess that whole energy system and the implications. If you use electricity for the production of a hydrogen, where does that electricity come from? Where in general does the electricity come from for your whole system? What is the growth rate of your electricity? And when will that hydrogen be available? When will those electrolyzers be available? These are really young and new technologies. So we cannot picture that in 2030 it will play a major role in terms of weight, but it is finally, as I mentioned before, giving us solutions for sectors that until recently did not have a clear decarbonized future.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think the main point is to actually ensure that we have the basis first for in order to produce green hydrogen. As you said, like green hydrogen must come first from the clean electricity produced from renewable energy. So I think first we have to ensure that basis first. So still quite a long way to go if you ask me, especially in ASEAN itself. I think we will definitely focusing on expanding renewable energy development in our region. So just another quick question. You also mentioned that in the EU, there are a lot of differences between member states, and that cooperation is definitely key in order to steer the policy in renewable energy to the right direction. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you bridge that gaps between different member states, especially considering the differences in terms of economic capacity that they can invest in promoting renewable energy in their own countries? Because I think in ASEAN, we do also have the same disparities among member states.
The first thing is that we have a collective EU target, but it's then distributed between member states, and that distribution was based on a number of criteria which reflected the potential and how easy it would be and how far each country could realistically go towards achieving that target. So a sharing of that collective effort. And then we refined this in later versions of our legislation and our target by including new mechanisms which allowed countries that overshot their own target to, in a way, sell that excess to other countries that found it harder to make progress, which allows to adjust a bit your approach as you go, because some countries might find new economies in a way, and new potentials that were not identified earlier. And instead of, it gives you an incentive to go further and go beyond your own target. But at a regional level, it also ensures that the most readily and most economic potentials are identified and are exploited at the scale of the region, and not only country by country. So that's purely in terms of target and legal incentives in a way. And then in terms of infrastructure planning, that's very important as well. As I mentioned, we are building an internal market with the aim to reduce overall energy costs for our consumers and allow that one country doesn't incur very high energy costs, because it's all related. So the connections allow within one single market cheap electricity to flow into a country where the demand is higher. It also allows to balance and better match demand with supply, and therefore to reduce also those pressures. And it allows to tap into areas that would have a very high potential. In our case, you have places in Southern Europe, like Spain, for instance, with high solar irradiation, big potential for solar energy. The North Sea, where the world's highest wind energy potentials are concentrated. And connecting these to the rest of Europe allows really energy to flow, and allows us to keep expanding into those regions without creating a kind of dead end where we have to curtail that electricity production. And if countries plan together the infrastructure, it also allows to avoid to have a series of small individual connections, let's say, but develop the grid and identify which are the key infrastructure elements for the regional system to really unlock those potentials economically. So joint legislation, sharing the whole target, and joint planning of infrastructure projects, and gradually we're moving into joint development of actual generation projects where countries can go together to finance some projects, or where countries can open their own auction systems to projects located in other countries.
Thank you very much. That is definitely very interesting, and I think it's something that we could take notes from. In ASEAN, we do have a lot of mechanisms among ASEAN member states in order for high levels of each member state to actually come together and discuss shaping the regional direction together. So I think we in ASEAN definitely could make advantage of those mechanisms that exist. And learn from the EU experience in that regard as well.
And if I may add something,
yeah.
So here we're talking about the more or less centralized grids or large grids, let's say, but we also cooperate specifically on the topic of islands, which is something that you might find interesting. There's an EU initiative for clean energy on EU islands, where a secretariat and a technical assistance facility support islands with the kind of blueprint for decarbonization strategies, and islands in various countries have the very similar challenges of isolation, need to import their energy, being stuck with fossil fuels for all uses, basically, high costs of everything, including energy. But they don't necessarily know about others, and you can really replicate very easily some approaches. You can do it at the scale of a country, but you can also do it at the scale of a region. So that's also something where we're working on.
Okay. And you raise a very interesting point in terms of islands. I think because in ASEAN we do have a lot of islands, especially our friend from Indonesia. It's an island, an archipelagos country, or the Philippines, for example. How do you ensure electricity or energy stability for those islands? Do you have to encourage a sort of community level development of energy production, or it can be transported or transmitted from the mainland?
It depends. In Europe, we have both. Of course, many of our islands are connected to the mainland. We're smaller. Our islands tend to be close, and we always have single grids, let's say, in our countries, but we have a number of non-interconnected islands as well. For those ones, it's related to what I said about the energy system. We have many more solutions by now. We understand much more how the energy system works. Batteries are more and more available. Electric vehicles will basically be batteries on wheels as well. So if you can have a system that uses that, you can already more easily balance your system. In terms of financing, you mentioned it, it's really community approaches that are very important. We established at European level definitions of so-called renewable energy communities, which is a structure where citizens, associations, small companies, and local authorities can come together to produce, share, and sell their own electricity. So we have a supportive framework in all member states to develop those kind of approaches. And in islands especially, it's very important. There are often very strong local sense of identities, of belonging, and it's really a way to promote this, to share the benefits of these building rooftop PV or 2 wind turbines on your island. And And then you can really have something at the scale of the whole island, establishing, of course, innovative systems like so-called virtual power plants, where you also manage a bit the demand. You have batteries managing the system. So we're working on that. It's not easy. It's not easy, and the hardest thing is usually transport on the island and to and from the island, where converting to clean energy is still much harder. But we already have many stories, so there as well we're happy to share some.
That's great. I think we've learned a lot from EU, not only in terms of policy direction and the importance of collaboration. Also, the question of technology is definitely one of the issues to consider, and I think ASEAN, the EU is definitely a very strong partner for ASEAN in that we do have a lot of projects on development, not only in terms of sustainable development in general, and I think we are also embarking on a new partnership on energy specifically. So it would be very great to actually develop a joint project or further our cooperation on this area as well. Let me see if I have any. Right. Okay. So I think in the interest of time, thank you very much, Matthew, for your insightful and for your comments and insightful presentation. I think we definitely have a lot of food for thought in order to develop and further enhance our capacity in renewable energy in ASEAN. I see no further questions from the participants, but rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, that we will definitely share presentation materials from all the speakers after the session. So thank you very much, Matthew, for your time today, and I definitely hope that the partnership between ASEAN and EU would definitely go stronger, especially in terms of renewable energy. I think we both have a lot of potentials to further enhance our partnerships in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now, ladies and gentlemen, from the regional viewpoint, we will now zoom in to a national practice. And I think if you talk about renewable energy, one country definitely comes to mind. One of the countries that is definitely a world's renewable superpower, I must say, is Norway. With 98% of all electricity production comes from renewable energy sources, Norway is indeed in a very unique position to show us the success story and also lessons learned in promoting renewable energy within the country, within the framework of the national legislation and within the framework of national practice. I have the honor to welcome today Mr. Jon Ulrich Hoheim, Senior Vice President of Statkraft AS, which is a Norwegian state-owned renewable energy company that is today Europe's largest renewable energy producer and a global company in energy market operations. Mr. Hoheim has been working with the Norwegian energy sector for over 35 years and has gained extensive experience both in operations, markets, mergers, and acquisitions, as well as regulatory issues. And he has previously been responsible for large hydropower construction projects within Norway, and presently he's a board member representative for Europe in International Hydropower Association as well. Mr. Hoheim, the floor is yours. Thank you for waiting. Yes, please.
Thank you. It was very interesting to listen to the presentation from the two previous speakers. In my opinion, it's simple to achieve it, but it's also extremely complicated. And it is about having the political will to implement sort of this change. It is a decision on which natural resource to utilize and how to, and where and how to utilize it. And it is creating a framework for investments. We are driven by incentives. For instance, today, 80% of new cars sold in Norway are electric, and that is purely because of the incentives that we have on electric vehicles. First, a bit about Norway. Maybe you can flip to slide number 1, or in the next slide, I'm sorry. We're a very small country far up north, neighboring Sweden, Finland, and Russia. We're very small compared to your region, only about 5.5 million people, kingdom and democracy. We are also a very large oil producer. Around 1970, we found oil and gas in the North Sea to the west of Norway, and that is utilized quite extensively. And we are now one of the largest exporter of gas to Europe. Otherwise, we have fisheries and industry, but more and more it's over to service. Where we have the GDP is around $90,000 per capita, which makes us number 4 in the world. And I would say that the development of the GDP is very closely linked to the development of the energy sector in Norway. The picture to the left in the slide shows yearly precipitation, yearly rainfall in Norway, and as you can see, it is very wet on the western side of Norway, and it's also a mountain range located right inside of the shore, so that we have a large ability to make huge reservoirs to save water. The eastern part of the country is more inland climate. And the next slide, please. As you understand, we have a near net zero in a power system, and we are actually quite proud of that. It is not as big as yours, of course, with so many people, but we have a capacity of around 38,000 megawatt and a yearly generation of about 155 terawatt hours. We have a small surplus, so normally we export a part of our generation to neighboring countries. The yearly generation, of course, varies a lot because of the dependency of rainfall and also wind. You see there's a small amount of wind power, of 14 to 15 terawatt hours per year, and a very, very small part of thermal generation that's mostly connected to the oil industry. And I can share with you the story how this came about. Next slide, please. This is a picture of mountains, part of the mountains in Norway, and as you see, water is not always available. During the winter time, it comes as snow. So when we have resource available, that would normally be during the summertime or the springtime when the snow is melting and the rain is coming during the autumn. So then that is when we have the resource available. But of course, seeing that picture, you understand that we need a lot of power during the cold winter time. So how to manage that? Next slide, please. Well, that's building reservoirs. So when we have the main inflow during summertime, as shown in the blue line, and the consumption is mostly in the winter time, here shown by the black line, we need to move that amount of water or amount of energy from summer to winter, and that we do by means of reservoirs. We build large hydropower reservoirs, and presently we have about 50% all European hydropower reservoirs in our little country. And my company, Statkraft, have about 25% of the European hydropower reservoir in our portfolio. So that is sort of how we did that. It's not sort of based on grid stability or anything like that. It was merely a sort of a recognition that we needed to move that water, that energy from summer to winter. Next slide, please. The development of this power system, it started to grow quite rapidly after Second World War, and that was a political decision. The government realized that we needed to modernize the Norwegian society and industrialize it. And we had to do that based on available natural resources. And hydropower was the cheapest. And sort of that resource was available in large amount. And Statkraft and other companies were used as a political tool to establish more power generation. And that generation was often co-located with large power-consuming industry, for instance, aluminium melters. I will come back to a bit more about this timeline and the sort of regulatory issues that were sort of important for that time. But I can mention that it was a regulated business all the way up to around 1992, where we had a completely market-based system. Next, please. Wind power is not so heavily dominated in our system. It's about 14 to 15 terawatt per year. And we started with that in 2002. It was not competitive until then, but has since then increased its competitiveness. Now we see a major opposition against wind power. That's mainly because of environmental issues. This is the NIMBY issue. We don't want it in our own backyard. So it's a push for sort of having wind installation offshore. So the government is now planning for a large auction next year for offshore wind development. Wind power has, of course, less flexibility and a shorter life expectancy than compared to hydropower, but we have sufficient regulating capacity with the existing hydropower, so it's not any problem to implement it in the generation mix. Next one. This is maybe sort of a bit how this was done by the Norwegian politicians. Already before 1900, in 1890, Norwegian politicians understood the value of hydropower and water rights. And the same was happening with foreign investors. They came to Norway and bought up water rights from farmers. So the water rights, they are owned by the company or the person that owns the land that water is above. And there was a huge race for those water rights. And the politicians at that time, more than 100 years ago, they saw this and they wanted this resource to be on national, governed by state and counties. And they introduced a panic law in 1906 that required concession to own water rights. And later they implemented laws that required reversion to the state without compensation for private companies. If they had built hydropower, they needed to deliver that back to the state after a 60-year period. And the result of this is that presently 90% of all hydropower that we have in Norway today is actually owned by the state, counties, or municipalities. And it's a fairly large contribution that comes from the hydropower development that goes to the counties and to the municipalities. And that is taken the form of taxes and concessional power at very favorable prices. The ownership of wind power is not regulated in the same way. There, private persons and companies can own wind power. And in order to make this happen, the state and the counties played a substantial role developing Norway to be a modern industrial state. And in this period after World War II, it was regulated prices so that the investor was certain that the return on the investment was reasonable. And the government also established a water course plan so that it was clear what kind of project that was prioritized, so that we had a view on where to develop and how to develop. That plan was based on environmental issues and also financial performance of the different projects. And at the same time, government also had a one-stop shop for licensing, so that you could apply for a concession at the governmental body, Norwegian Directorate for Energy, and they would sort of coordinate all comments and hearing in order to make a proposal for the government on the concession later on. In the same period, also a lot of water courses were protected by law. And in this period, most of the large hydropower in Norway, that's when they were sort of developed. Around 1990, we had a surplus of energy, and it was then decided to implement a new Energy Act. And then the competition in generation was introduced. So today, it's a competitive market where all the utilities, they bid in their power on the power exchange, that's called Nord Pool. And distribution companies, they give them their offers on how much to buy on different price levels. So it's a daily auction, and the prices are set every hour, every day, all year long. In addition to, and it's a sort of, the auction is pay as cleared. So everybody gets paid the clearing price. In In addition to the power exchange, there's also an exchange that deals with the forward and future sales, financial sales, and that is where sort of a lot of the market turmoil is discussed now in Europe because of the very high prices and need to place cash collateral. I won't go more into that now because it takes a bit long time, I think. In this period after 1990, investments are based on the investor's price forecast. So it's solely done on merchant basis, on the price that the investor is assuming will be relevant for the next decades. In around 2000, politicians in Norway said that the time for large hydro is over, and after that, not a lot of hydropower is developed, only small-scale hydro actually. But the wind was then picking up, so that we started to develop wind power, as I explained earlier. In around 2012, we also saw that we needed to increase our power generation, and a green certificate scheme was introduced, and that was a technology-neutral support scheme, giving an additional premium on top of the ordinary price set in the market for renewable energy. And the situation today is, of course, that we have this extreme high energy prices in Europe, large market turmoil, and we also see a large expected growth in domestic demand requiring more generation capacity. And that will probably come from offshore wind because there are somewhat limited hydro resources left for development. I think we can take the next slide. This is sort of what I went through regarding just to mention it in more writing. So I think we can skip that and go to the next one. We also have sort of the incentives. They are based on framework condition from the government, and that is mostly done through taxes and fees. You also implement framework condition to promote climate targets by means of building codes, deciding on fuel composition, support for electric vehicles, etc. So that's done on the national level. In addition to that, we also have a governmental body to support Norway to meet its climate ambition, and they manage industrial and household programs to move energy use from emission from oil and gas to electric use, and they also have programs to make energy use more efficient. Next slide. We also see that we are, of course, located in many European countries and countries in Asia and in South America, and we see a lot of different incentives in order to promote this development to a greener society. So there are contract for difference, you have the RES auctions, you have the feed-in tariffs, premium top of merchant prices, tax rates, fast depreciations, or also we see subsidized debt in some countries. So their sort of national government needs to prioritize how they will support and make framework conditions available for the investors. I think we can take the next one. Here I'll try to sort of list what we think is important for our perspectives on developing as a sort of private investor in many different countries, and what we would expect from the countries, the authorities that we are investing in, and what you should actually expect from the investors. I think you should expect that investors, of course, they have zero tolerance for corruption, and that they deliver sustainable project with strong value creation, and that this value creation is divided by sort of between the investor, the state, and the region in a fair way. I think we should also see that we have a transparency in project development and a good stakeholder management so that relevant parties are heard and taken into account. Projects should deliver community benefits so that they are able to be supported locally. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to develop large infrastructure projects. And of course, affected people should be treated fair. We should aim at improving livelihood for all people, and especially indigenous people and vulnerable groups. We don't think we should mess with heritage sites, and we see that it's the drive to make good projects that is to also minimize and compensate for negative impacts of those projects. What we are looking for as an investor would be financial viable project, of course. We can take merchant exposure, or we can have secured revenues in form of contract for difference, feed-in tariffs, etc. But we can do both, and many large utilities can do that. We are also looking for stable conditions and a predictable framework. We do not like that framework condition jump up and down and it's not stable. That is something a private investor is not very fond about. Maybe next slide. We also see that if the authorities, if the nations have a clear priorities for licensing, what kind of project they want to sort of develop, and that they have a licensing process that is capable of handling application, that is a huge advantage, and that is sort of prioritized so that we know where the government want to sort of develop large infrastructure projects. Having a playing field at this level and a transparency in the licensing process, we also think is very important. And as a foreign investor, we think it's a good idea to have a sort of one-stop shop, as we did in this period after World War II, and have that support from the government in the licensing process. These projects cannot be developed unless you have a sufficient mature grid to take this power and transfer it to large consumption area. So the development of the grid is, of course, of a vital importance. And of course, we should follow international guidelines on good practice. The thing I started with was that it's easy, but it's at the same time very complicated. It requires political will, It requires a decision on which natural resource to use and where to use it and how to use it. And it's about creating the framework condition that attracts investments in that region. I think I will stop there with the last slide. This is battery. It is Lake Blåsjø, Blue Lake. It's located at 1,000 meters above sea level in the western part of Norway. It contains 8 terawatt hours of energy. So it can fuel a large city for several years, or at least large in our context, maybe not in the ASEAN context. But it's one of our large batteries that we are dependent on when the winter comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoheim, for your very comprehensive views on the development of Norwegian renewable energy sector, as well as the policy and regular framework of the Norwegian government. I think you shed a very important light on the importance of incentives for private sector, because as we think when we think about renewable energy, definitely what comes to mind first is in terms of costs. And investing in renewable energy usually incur a lot of costs and a lot of a large investment involved. So I think incentivizing private sector to actually see the benefits and also see the viability of the projects is definitely important. And I think that is one thing that we can definitely learn from. I wish to open the floor first for participants to ask questions if there's any. Otherwise, I could also start with the questions of my own, but it's just to kind of stimulate the discussion a little bit. You definitely mentioned the role of private sector and the role of government regulators to incentivize the investment by providing a clear and transparent regulatory frameworks. I was wondering whether there's any room for smaller companies in the renewable energy sector. We're talking about MSMEs, or companies that do not necessarily define themselves as large company with huge amount of resources to invest in developing in renewable technologies. Do you think there's a room in the market itself for investors that are relatively small? Because I think we in ASEAN we do have a lot of MSMEs or relatively smaller companies in the market, and I think it would be very beneficial indeed if we can also incentivize them or provide a room of a sector in the market for them, so to say, whether it be investment in a community level or smaller technologies. What is your views on that?
Yes, I definitely think so, and especially for solar power, that is a bit more cheaper and not so capital intensive as the large hydro project. It will be room for smaller players, and if you have also the right framework condition with security on revenues, etc., then smaller companies can attract financial investors to sort of take part as lenders, so they are able to lift larger projects. So we have a number of companies in all around the world that attracts financial investors and do solar projects. So it's a huge interest for green energy by financial investors and looking for a rather limited but certain return on their investment.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions from participants at this stage?
Hello, can you hear my voice?
Yes, Dr. Paul Sian Kem, please.
Yes, I am from Myanmar. My question is not directly to the expert. I would like to discuss with the organizer and the member country that participant. the presentations are very quite interesting. And what I would like to know is how could we circulate among in the ASEAN country? The organizer will negotiate the ASEAN Secretary Office and how it will be the next step. And when you circulate it, please include the very interesting points of today's presentation. Thank you.
So if I understand your question correctly, how could we in ASEAN stimulate policy exchange or implementation, right?
Yeah, both.
Mm.
To exchange and to implementation and to how to invite the private companies. Thank you.
Right. I think I would first refer to, I'm not sure whether I'll call whether the Mr. Beni Suryadi is still with us, but I think I'm probably going to refer to our colleagues from the ASEAN sectoral bodies or the ASEAN centers to elude us on this question first. Mr. Suryadi, are you still with us? Right. So I think within ASEAN itself, we do have the sectoral bodies that are in charge of energy sector specifically, and there are regular meetings among the high levels and also at the official levels, at the working levels as well. And we do have a lot of centers to promote the nexus between the policy deliberated at the sectoral levels into the private sector realm, into the implementation sector. I think it is definitely up to the participants of those sectoral bodies from the government sector and also from the centers, various centers, to actually bring forth the policy that has been discussed into developments on the ground. But as Mr. Hoheim has mentioned, political will is definitely an important factor in ensuring a successful implementation of any public policy. So I think not only the government and public policy would be the important catalyzing factor in terms of designing a policy that is clear in direction and also that is transparent and set the common goals among our member states, but also the political will to follow through those implementation. I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but I think it's not definitely it's definitely a point of discussion on how we could promote further implementation on the grounds of the policies that we have established. So I think rather a question, I think it is a food for thought for all of the participants here. I think because we have participants from various sectors, not only the public sector themselves, but also private sector and academic sector. I think it is definitely up to all of us to come together and make sure that the policies that we have designed will be definitely implemented, and vice versa. We definitely have the role to play in informing public sector and policymakers of the need for transparency, of the need for clarity, and the needs of the consumers themselves. Any comments from the floor at this stage? I think this is definitely a valid point on how could we, accelerate policy implementation, because we definitely have so many meetings and so many frameworks and mechanisms in ASEAN itself. So if I may ask Dr. Paul Sienkam, if I pronounce your name correctly, what do you think one of the ways that we can do in order to ensure more private sector engagements with the policymaker and also to make sure that our policy direction would be implemented on the ground?
You know, let's go back, see the past 10 years, 20 years, we can see some of these European private company, American and other company are invested in ASEAN country, not only in Myanmar, not only in Thailand, in many among our ASEAN countries. In this point, one country to one country is not exactly the same place, the same conditions. So today we are talking about in the like a group as an ASEAN. In this way, when we invited the Norwegian private company or something like that, I mean, I would like to form up the ASEAN format for ASEAN country, something like that. Benefit sharing, investment, and so and so. No, Myanmar, one thing, try one thing, Vietnam are different. I do not want like this. For ASEAN member country, we need one rule, one regulation to invite American, Europe, Norwegian private companies so that we can work easily in the future. So that is my idea, my suggestion. I don't know if it is possible or not possible exactly. Thank you very much. I would like to extend my sincere very thanks to all the presenter and the organizer Trident. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I definitely agree with your point. ASEAN needs to speak with one voice in order to make our policy a lot more impactful and ensure that our policy would be truly beneficial to our peoples. I think we can definitely, as an organization, as a regional organization, we definitely cannot have too many differences and too many varieties of policies and way forward in order to promote this as at a regional level. So I think your point is definitely valid, and I think it is political will is definitely important, and we as citizens can do our parts in order to ensure that our voices would be heard. So I guess it is up to us in the future, and also up to us in the public sector to ensure that this point is being addressed as well. So I think, yeah, I do have the question in the chat box, and I saw that Dr. Hoheim has already answered briefly. The question reads, does Norway's experience suggest that government-led projects are better than investor-led unsolicited projects, or both have merits? Dr. Hoheim, would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
I think it's not sort of who owns it. It's sort of the project team that sort of is important when you talk about project performance, and it can be equally good in state-owned companies that compared to private companies. So in my opinion, they are equal. They could be equally good.
Right, thank you. All right. Do we have any more questions or comments? So I take that none. We do have a comment. Sorry. Yes, we do have a comment on the point that we discussed earlier as well from Lord Bona. ASEAN should be voiced up as regional rather than by country in this regards. I definitely agree. So we could have a standard voice or template policy to attract investors. I think one of the ways we can try to achieve is to develop a standardized guidance on development of renewable energy infrastructure across the region as well. So that is one way to go ahead in order to ensure that the standard of infrastructure development is streamlined, and it's the same across the board. So yes, collaboration is definitely key in order to push forward with this agenda. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much, Mr. Hoheim, for your presentation. I think we definitely learned a lot from Norway. And the success of Norway in promoting renewable energy is definitely an inspiration for us in ASEAN, not only to promote renewable development in our own country, but also to collaborate within the region, and not just within the region itself. Once we are able to form a common vision on developing renewable energy as a region, we will then be able to further enhance our partnerships with our external partners as well. So thank you very much, Mr. Hoheim. It is definitely an honor to have you here with us.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, definitely the discussion on how can we further promote collaboration and partnerships is something that is ongoing, and development is definitely a progress for us to take into account and also to inspire us to work towards the same goal. And I hope that the discussion and the presentation that we have listened to today will provide some new perspectives and also food for thought for policymakers and practitioners in ASEAN in promoting transition towards sustainable energy in our region. So in closing, I have the honor today to welcome Mr. Jirachai Pankrasin, Executive Director of the ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue, to give the closing remarks. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you, Khun Dongporn. Distinguished participants, first of all, I would like to thank all of you for attending today's webinar on accelerating clean energy transition for Greener ASEAN. The ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue is pleased to be part of this ongoing series of webinars on topical issues related to the bio-circular green economy model. The center was established in 2019 to act as a regional catalyst to promote research on specific issues on sustainable development of mutual interest to the ASEAN member states, and to support dialogue within ASEAN and between ASEAN and external partners on sustainable development cooperation. These dialogue activities, such as today's webinar, are opportunities to engage with experts within ASEAN and from external partners to promote knowledge sharing and facilitate the exchange of views and best practices or lessons learned, and enhance capacity building on sustainable development, and most importantly, to build partnerships as we work to go towards our common goal of a more sustainable world. Today's topic, energy, is a key sector in our common endeavor towards a sustainable development, and is a major part of the bio-circular green economy model, where energy is one of the 4 strategic areas for development. Energy is an essential part of our everyday lives, whether it's for transport, electricity, cooking, lighting and heating and cooling. It is clearly something that we cannot do without. But energy is still the dominant contributor to climate change, accounting for 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, it is necessary for us, the global community, to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and accelerate our transition to clean, renewable energy in order to move forward towards a greener world. There has been much that has been done in this area, but more needs to be done. Current trends in renewable energy uptake needs to be scaled up substantially to be in line with the goals of SDG 7. In the ASEAN context, we have emphasized regional cooperation in energy as one of the priority areas for action in the 21st century. And we have heard earlier today, on the many plans of actions and mechanisms put in place to follow on this endeavor. Facilitating transition to sustainable energy also features in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as seen in the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. Yet we in ASEAN remains behind the curve in reaching the renewable energy targets that we have set for ourselves. Our aim is to achieve 20% renewable energy use by 2025. But under current trends, we are likely to achieve only 17% of total energy use, 17% of the total energy mix. In this situation, it is interesting to learn from the experiences of others in reaching renewable energy targets. The EU has shared with us the experiences and lessons learned from achieving the EU renewable energy target, including the key role of regional cooperation, the need for clear direction and policy guidelines, and the variety of issues likely to be faced and the specific solutions that we need to address them. Statkraft Norway provided us with the positive examples at the national level of the transition to renewable energy, especially in the area of hydro and wind power. The nexus between government policies and regulatory framework and the private sector and is important, and so is the issue of incentivizing investments and providing interest for the private sector to invest in the renewable energy sector. I believe that the dialogue today has been a useful knowledge-sharing exercise that provided information that can be applied to our efforts in the region to accelerate the transition to clean, reliable, and affordable energy for a greener ASEAN, and is also relevant to the BCG economy model. In conclusion, I would like to offer my special thanks to our speakers, Mr. Benny Suyadi of the ASEAN Center for Energy, Mr. Matthew Balu of the European Commission, Mr. John Ulrich Hoheim of Statkraft Norway for sharing their thoughts with us today. Thank you once again to all of you for joining us today in this webinar. And I look forward to seeing many of you again in the next session of this ongoing series of the webinar on the BCG economy model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jiroshai, and thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. I hope that this webinar has, in a small way, inspired us to work together and emphasize collaboration and common vision and frameworks and implementation, common actions on the ground for us in ASEAN. And in closing, I wish to remind our participants again that the webinar presentation materials will also be made available to all participants. We will be sending a link for you to download the presentation materials later on today or early next week. So please stay tuned for the materials. It will be sent to your registered email addresses, and also please stay tuned to our next session of this webinar series, where we'll share with you the approaches by our external partners and try to stimulate exchanges of ideas on how we could learn from our external partners or work with our external partners in promoting a more sustainable ASEAN community for all. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope to see you at our next session. สวัสดีค่ะ